You're going to learn to play that by the end of this video, and more importantly, what makes it work. That's an old Chet Atkins lick. It's one of my favorite Chet licks, but it really could have been anything by any great guitar player. If you want to learn to solo, if you want to learn to improvise, if you want to learn to be free on the guitar, your guitar lessons don't exist in a vacuum. You have to be listening to great players, and you have to be copying great players in order to speak the language. You didn't begin writing an original novel when you were learning to speak. It's the same way with music. Step one, the notes go hand in hand with the underlying chords and the underlying harmony. So first you need to identify what those chords are. Great soloists will create the sound of the chord changes as they're playing the melodic lines. That Chet lick perfectly outlines the chords from D7 to G7 back to C. With the chords in mind, then the notes make sense. Mechanically, Chet's starting here at the 4th fret on the 4th string, going up to the 7th fret, then to the 3rd string, 5th fret, then to the 2nd string, 5th fret. That forms an arpeggio that belongs to the chord D9. Mechanically, then he moves on to a series of pull-offs spanning from the 3rd string up to the 1st string, all between the 7th fret and the 5th fret. So you start on the 3rd string, and you repeat that same motion through the 2nd and 1st string. All together. That's outlining the top part of a D9 chord, and he's just leading into those strong chord tones. If the top part of a D9 is, this next part of the lick you just learned is leading into those tones by pulling off 2 frets above and landing on those strong chord tones. And as you're learning any language, you have to start putting the words together to form complete statements. So put the 2 parts we already learned together. And that can be moved anywhere along the neck. So suppose you wanted to play that over an E7. Or if you were playing over a tune and you needed to outline the C9 chord. What if you were soloing over something like I'll See You in My Dreams? Okay, so that's B flat 7. So as you're learning the language, always connect it to the underlying harmony, and always practice moving it along the fingerboard, which I liken in the book to a conveyor belt, and I hope it sees the light of day. If that interests you, and if you want to see the space grow and you haven't already subscribed, consider doing so, because this space has to grow and this community has to build in order for an audience to exist that makes it viable. After you've outlined the D9 chord tones, you continue to follow the same pattern in the left hand, moving up the 1st string only. And then the whole shape moves up 1 fret. Up 1 more, up 1 more. Isolated, it might sound like the circus. One of the things that was a challenge for Chet early on, he got fired a lot. He was too jazzy for the country people, and he was too country for the jazz people. The chromaticism there comes more out of the jazz vernacular. So Chet's star really didn't begin to rise until he started making his own records. In that way, even though perhaps to most other people it's an odd comparison, from the vantage point of my life and my inspirations and the most important guitar players to me, I personally have drawn a lot of parallels between Chet Atkins and Jimi Hendrix. They both strangely faced some of the same challenges. In that chromatic ascent on the 1st string, it's leading from a strong chord tone here up to here. That forms the top part of the D9 arpeggio. But instead of playing it straight like that, he's leading into those tones with this pattern. So when he goes 7, 6, 5, it's leading into that. Then when you move your hand up to the next fret to learn this lick, it's leading up again, and it's landing So if you just went, it's connecting two very strong chord tones on the top string by leading into them. One fret at a time. It's really no different than like when a bass player will do a chromatic. What do Chet Atkins and Tommy Shannon from Double Trouble have in common? Well, Tommy Shannon actually called and left a voicemail when I was about 14 years old at the house. That was pretty cool. Tommy's bass line over Pride and Joy does that same kind of a chromatic move. It's just in that case, the chromatic line moves downward, and in the case with the Chet lick, we move upwards. Stop and appreciate at this moment that we haven't said a word about scale degrees or theory yet. It's more important to see the connection to the underlying chords first, and the arpeggios and the basic hand positions first, before you then go back and make a little more concrete sense out of it as far as how it would line up on paper in terms of academic approaches. All of that forms what he plays over the D7 chord. At that point, the underlying chords in the rhythm section change, so it goes from D7, then to the G7. Joe Pass said, when the chords change, you change. Chet's got to do something, so you go from this down to a strong chord tone over the G7. But check this out. It lands there, it's connected to this G triad. It just looks like a cowboy D chord that's moved up. And yes, Townes Van Zandt uses that shape in To Live to Fly, which is probably my favorite song of all time. If you can write songs like Townes, don't even worry about the rest of this stuff. And I'll forget completely about the guitar because you're Shakespeare who learned a G chord. But for the rest of us, we've got to make sense of the chord change. So it's 7th fret down to 8th fret on the 2nd string. And you take this shape and you just move it down 1 fret at a time, playing each note individually. Then you go to the 3rd string. 7th fret on the 3rd string. Then stay in the 7th fret, move to the 4th string. Well, what does that look like? Visually, it's like you took the top part of an A minor chord in Mel Bay. Remember what I said yesterday about retaining the mind of a beginner? Take this shape. That's D minor. Why is Chet playing out of a D minor shape over a G7 chord? That gets into a slightly more advanced concept that we'll wait to unpack until later. But mechanically, his hands look like they're here. And after that, you'll finish the lick going to the 5th fret on the 3rd string, back to the 7th fret on the 4th string, and then it's got to resolve, so it'll go to the 4th fret. And at that point, the chord changes back to C, and we'll end on a C note. And the lick sounds like the chords. With the mechanics under your hands, let's give them scale degrees. Starting from the beginning, over the D7 chord, you've got major 3rd, 5th, flat 7, 9, root going back to the flat 7, major 3rd going back to the 9, 6th or 13 going back to the 5th, and then a chromatic walk up to the root that moves back to the flat 7. It's a lot of 1, 3, 5, flat 7. That's a dominant 7th arpeggio with some extensions, the 9 and the 13. But if you don't know that yet, you'll get there in good time. The point is, they're mostly the chord tones contained in the arpeggio. Then when it goes to the G7 chord tone, he begins on the 3rd, major 3rd, back to the root, walks down chromatically, and that's the 9 up top, back to the flat 7, to the 5th, down to the 9th again, in a lower octave, then to the 4 major third. And those are all scale tones, not fret numbers. I started building this space and putting together the writings in hopes that it would be a home for people who feel a bit academically homeless as far as the guitar stuff goes. In my experience, all too often formal education really looks down on rock and roll and rhythm and blues and street music. And meanwhile, the entirely self-taught, for those about to rock, we salute you, that contingent of player has a really difficult time bridging the gap between getting out of bread and butter, very basic positions, and understanding a more comprehensive view of the fingerboard. Everything I'm seeking to do here on the channel for you, and everything I was hoping to accomplish with building up the website, was to bridge that gap. Chet was great. This takes absolutely nothing away from his genius, but he was just outlining the chord changes. It's the way that he did it while speaking a musical language. So remembering what I said in the video on great guitar players are not perfect guitar players, and I mentioned a few words about the importance of rhythm and stress or lack of stress in terms of which part of the beat the notes fall on. On the triplets, remember triplets go strong, weak, weak. So you've got the strong chord tone, and then the weaker parts of the beat follow. Then when it goes up chromatically, you've got strong chord tone, but when it winds up on the 6th fret, and then it winds up back here, which is not a strong chord tone, until you get into jazz language, in which case that would be an augmented 5. But that last note falls on a weak part of the beat. Then it goes up. That's the major 7, and it's a stronger part of the beat, but it's leading right up to the root at the beginning of the next triplet. It all fits together. Thank you for watching and for taking part. Without you, there's no fretboard playground, so I really hope that we can make this work together. I'm doing my very best to get this train moving forward for you. We'll keep having fun together, cracking the code of the fingerboard. And I'll see you again really soon.